Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted with Susan Smith.
Hello and welcome. I'm Susan Smith, and many thanks to my son Will, who did that little opening Sean Connery wannabe for me. I'm here with my coffee cup, fixing to get quilting today. Usually I'm coming to you live and unscripted on Friday mornings. Today it is still unscripted, as you can see with the coffee cup fumble, but it is not live. I'm actually in Canada for the month of November, spending some time with family, so these episodes will not be live. However, I still wanted to bring you some quilting content that you can enjoy and perhaps learn a few things from as you're busy quilting, perhaps going into the Christmas season and working on projects of your own. So here we are in my studio, Stitched by Susan. At my long arm Lucy, she's just off beside me, fixing to work on a tree skirt. So today's project is just that. It's freehand quilting, edge to edge, across a tree skirt. So before we get into the actual project, here's a few things you ought to know. Generally, these episodes come to you the first and third Friday of each month. So at least twice a month, you get this content of what I call quilting's first reality show. So it's me quilting in my studio and it's unedited. So whatever happens, you hit the ruler with the needle or the needle breaks, all those things are right built into the show and I just talk my way through them. It's often not that dramatic, but I do try and talk my way through whatever project I'm quilting on. It's generally from start to finish, right from loading all the way through the quilting process, and just talking about the things that are unique to that project, the choices and decisions that I'm making, and how I work my way through it. I think this can be so helpful to long arm quilters who often work in solitude and don't get to see how others do it. I know I would have loved to see this kind of thing, to get a peek into someone else's studio when I was early in my quilting years. So I hope that is helpful to you, and I try and be just really honest about things as I do them. So take a moment, if you would, to like this post and subscribe to the channel. If this is content that you really enjoy, please share it with your friends. That really helps me to get visibility, and I sure appreciate it. A couple other places that you can also find me. I have a podcast called Measure Twice, Cut Once. And that is often interview-based with other quilters and crafters, and sometimes it's just me talking about lessons I've learned from quilting or from business, those sorts of things. So just some easy listening. Again, it's Measure Twice, Cut Once, and you can find that easily at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. Another thing you might be interested in, if you would like to support this show, you can do that very simply at a little website called buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. There you can contribute as little as $5, and you can do it just one time, or if you want to, you can sign up to do that monthly as well. All of those dollars go toward continually trying to better our equipment and the show that we produce so that it gets clearer and sharper and the sound gets better. So that's what we do with the Buy Me a Coffee money. So we appreciate those of you who have contributed to that very generously. What am I missing, Dave? Just one other thing before we head into today's quilting project. I offer a masterclass, a freehand quilting masterclass, which is a really intensive dive into the world of freehand and specifically edge-to-edge quilting. That's the kind of quilting that I love best to do. And my whole class is geared toward taking away the intimidation and maybe even the fear of striking out freehand without a pattern. So within the masterclass, it's 6 modules that are delivered to you weekly. You have access over 30 distinct designs that I talk about, draw out in some cases, quilt out for you in all cases. As well, there's quite a bit of emphasis on what I call the anatomy of a good freehand design. So talking about how to build in transitions or movement or keep yourself from getting quilted into a corner, all that practical stuff with the goal in mind that you can then create your own freehand work from ideas that you have and you know how to create a pleasing and quiltable design. And then too, there's a strong emphasis on practice methods. Again, Constant repetition does not necessarily make you better. Doing a thing 100 times does not necessarily make you better. But there's ways to practice or to quilt intentionally and with purpose, just like there's ways to practice your golf swing or reading music that can help you advance in your skill quite rapidly. So there's a heavy emphasis on that as well. So if that interests you at all, you can go to my website, which is simply stitchedbysusan.com. And there is a Stitched by Susan Academy tab, and under there are a number of learning resources, including the Freehand Quilting Masterclass. And the other large learning resource that I have is a rather new monthly membership in which I offer additional freehand designs. There's no repeats from the masterclass. So new designs, sometimes guest teachers, sometimes case studies of projects that I worked on in my studio. So there's new content for you each and every month, as well as connection with me within that membership. So that too can be found under that Stitched by Susan Academy tab. So with all that said, again, take a moment to like and subscribe, and we will get on to today's quilting project. I'll have one more sip of my magic elixir before we get going. Okay, I'm just going to go off camera and grab the backing, and we'll get started. Today's project is a tree skirt, as I believe I mentioned earlier, and it is for the Fat Quarter Shop, which many of you know and love. And so in the show notes, I will be putting a link to the specific pattern and fabric that it is made from. Fat Quarter Shop will have kits, patterns, all the things you need available if indeed you would like to make a tree skirt like this. And today the backing is, it's not the Minky brand, but it's a Minky-type fabric with a little knobbly on it, a little bit stretchy. So we're going to talk as we load about some of the tips that I've found for working with Minky fabric. So many quilt makers love the result from using this fabric, but find it a bit fiddly to work with. So let's talk. The big elephant in the room is the fact that it is stretchy in both directions. So I think the first thing to be wary of, to be aware of, is that you do not, in fact, stretch it when you're placing it on your long arm rails. So as often as I can, pretty much every time, I try and load it so that I'm loading the selvage edges on the rails. To load the cut edges, it's really tricky to not get any stretching going on. But even with the selvage edge, if you look at a length of it, you can see how it's kind of rippling and loose. So I'm actually going to put a little bit of effort into squeezing that in just a little as I load it, and I'm going to keep watching my fabric below to make sure that it is smooth and that it's not getting stretched out as I'm loading this edge. I'm also, I believe, going to put my red snapper about an inch down into the fabric. That too will help me avoid that really stretched, just the very, very perimeter of the fabric is stretched, the very edge. And I will double check this as I go, and I may even reload my snapper once or twice just to make really sure of this process. If I keep my part over the rail smooth as I go, I can see if there's any stretching or distortion going on here. But it's looking pretty good. I was given a very, very generous piece of backing. I almost wish I had trimmed it off beforehand because it's going to be much wider than I need. So I don't know if you can see on camera, but there's a little bit of ruffling going on here, but even just an inch into the fabric, there's much less of that. So that's why I've got this little lip hanging off the top. That's just helping me to keep it proper tension on it. I think I'm going to need another whole one. A half won't do, much like a cup of coffee. A half just will not cut it. I just have to move Lucy out of the way, and I might actually have to move her to the other end. Let's see here. What you guys, again, can't see on camera is I'm attached by cords to Dave's recording equipment. And yes, I will have to move Lucy, so bear with me. This is going to be a little bit of a process to move her all the way to the other end. If I had thought this through well, folks, I would have known this beforehand, but I didn't. So there we go. She's all the way out the other end. So if you do not use the red snapper system and you are pinning this, exactly the same cautionary tale. Just be really sure that you're not overstretching it. So maybe put some pins at each end and in the middle, and then pin in between so that you've got kind of a checkpoint there. You'll see when I bring the quilt. It's only about half this big. And certainly I could trim it off beforehand. Now that I'm this far, I'm just going to leave it on and roll it up and cut it off when the quilt is finished. It's going to be a little bit fiddly because Lucy's kind of in the way here. Let's see what else we could move. Okay, so now I'm pulling my fabric all over the long arm rail. Again, I'm visually checking that it's not pulling to one side or the other with those angled creases. I want it to be as smooth as possible before I start rolling it on. And at one end here, I've just got a couple pins in because the rod that's underneath my snapper ends right here. So it's not gripping quite right. So I'm just putting a couple pins in there to hold the proper tension on it. There we go. And now we'll start rolling. I'm having a hard time watching underneath. It's so long. There we go. Now I can see it. So I'm just watching from underneath the quilt to see when the edge of the backing is reaching the edge of my leader. Double checking that everything's smooth and flat. It's looking good. And again, exactly the same thing is true on this side. You can see there's a little bit of roughness in that edge. I'm just going to take extra care that I don't stretch that out in any way as I'm attaching my grippers. And I kind of do that by almost basting with my left hand, holding it in place really tightly, and then just pressing it on with my right hand. I know there are those who use the red snappers who feel that if you bend them backwards, it opens them up, opens the channel up, and makes them easier to snap on. And that is true, but I feel like that tends to push my fabric out of place, so I prefer to, a foot or 14 inches out, I put it in place, clamp it with my left hand, and then squeeze it on in all the distance between. And it's a little bit of a making me breathe heavy. The Minky is thick, so it goes on a little harder than a cotton fabric. And when I see that it's distorting the fabric, I just pull it off a few inches, place it again, And do it one more time. That looks much better. The Minky is very heavy, so I'm seeing that it actually is pulling over the leader a little bit, so I'm just tugging it back into position. And I'm just using my judgment and experience of when it looks equal kind of flow here to what it has on the far end. If you can't tell that by looking, then try it once, roll it up and see if it's, flat and smooth. And if it's not, you might have to adjust this last one too. Just the weight of the Minky is literally pulling it into that sag. And I need one more pin here as well, and I have to walk all the way around because of cords and cables. Getting my steps in today. And I see from looking from that vantage point that I didn't squeeze one part on quite tight. Maybe all of you saw it from where you're viewing too. But let's get that squeezed into place. That's better. Okay. Now that I've had my aerobic exercise for the morning, we have a quilt bag loaded. There it is. Now again, because the Minky is stretchy, do you want to put me on the main camera again? Because the Minky does have that stretchy quality, we do not want to tighten the rails up too much. If you have them tight and then you do your quilting and then you release, the Minky's going to go whew, back into shape, and you'll end up with a quilt that's always wanting to be curved. It's always the edges are wanting to roll up. So have only enough tension to keep it flat and smooth and no more. My batting, this will come as no surprise to those of you who watch regularly, is Hobbs 80/20. And I'm going to go ahead and quilt at one end just to be most efficient with the fabric. Which end would you prefer me to be at, Dave? Doesn't matter, so we're going to quilt at this end. So I'll leave myself a few inches of leeway here to be clipping to. And that way there's possibly enough Minky left in one nice chunk for a baby quilt. Oh, and I got my batting loaded sideways. My fold is at one side instead of at the bottom. Let's try that again. It comes off the roll folded in half, and it's cut almost square, so I didn't see where that was. Now I see it. There we go. And I just let that excess batting fall to the floor. And again, when the quilt is finished, trim it all off in one chunk. So here's our little quilt, our little tree skirt. So at this point, look at that. You guys are getting a different view. It's moving as we talk. At this point, it is a square quilt. And after it is quilted and goes back to Fat Quarter Shop, they will cut the opening in it for the tree skirt, finish all the edges, etc. This is one of two tree skirts that I'm doing for them. If you haven't seen the other one yet, it is called, do you know, I can't recall the title, but it has tree skirt in it too. So it would have been released in October. And it was a little different in that it was an 8-sided small quilt. And so there was a little more extra thought go into the basting of it to keep it nice and evenly octagonal. Okay, we're good to go there. Let's bring Lucy back into the picture. I need to lower my rail. I must have had a chubby quilt on here last. My take-up rail is quite high. And by the way, usually when I'm doing this live, you're able to type in questions as we go, and I answer them as we work. However, I also see those questions after the fact on my YouTube channel. And so if you do have questions about this process, feel free still to type them in, and over time I will come back and answer them. for you. I think you'll find that this is a fairly straightforward quilt. It's just a nice example for you of working with Minky. So I've loaded it now, and I'll talk through it a bit more as I do each advance as well. So I'm quilting today with a 100% polyester thread in my favorite brand, Isacord. It's an eggshell color, 0101 is the color number if you use that thread. And I was quilting late last night actually, with a silvery thread. So all I do is cut the thread back by the spool portion, which is way at the back of my machine, knot the new thread onto it, and pull it all the way through. Other than the needle, which I do need to thread each time because obviously the knot will not feed through the needle. Okay, we're all set. You know what, Dave? Now that I've decided to go at this end, I do not know that my wire actually reaches. It does not quite. Okay, folks, just a little adjustment here, and it's pretty easy. We're going to pull the whole thing a little bit. That should do it. Oh, but I have to move to the front too. We're just double checking the reach of our cords. Okay, we're sacrificing a little bit of Minky because we do not want to unplug a camera. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing? Now we're all set. Okay, so we're going to baste this in place exactly like we would a regular quilt. My basting line falls within the 1/4 inch seam allowance at the edge so that all this basting sewing will be caught within that seam allowance. I have channel locks, magnetic channel locks on my machine, so I'm able to lock this into place so that I get a perfectly straight line, in this case a vertical line. If you don't have that option, you might need to use a ruler, or you might want to pin it in place first with a little more measuring process. But if you do have the channel lock, it's very handy. Now I'm kind of looking out ahead because I see across my the top of the quilt, that there is a bit of a jog in one of the seams. The edge isn't lining up, so I need to offer enough leeway for that. So you'll see a wider seam allowance happening under my needle, and that's why. I can see that coming up, and I'm making some allowance for it because I've got to catch that shorter piece of fabric in this basting. And there it comes. Now you can see it. You certainly could use a longer basting stitch. Taking a shortcut, I just choose to do my basting in the same length of stitch as my quilting will be. And again, I've got my vertical channel lock on so that I'm getting a perfectly straight seam here. And I do see that my seam allowance is going wide, but again, I see in advance I've got a little bit narrower area coming up. So I'm taking that into account. You probably haven't seen it yet. It was a little below my hopper foot there, but it will come in the next pass. Okay, so that's our 3 sides basted. So we'll go ahead and put the magnetic rails on the front. This is a question that so often gets asked. These are just hardware store variety magnetic rods, and they just hold this front edge firmly in place. I do have iron rails, so you need metal rails, obviously, for the magnets to work, but it just provides that 4th line of stability. So now my whole quilting surface is stable and can't shift and move in any direction. That's my goal. So again, that all helps with the Minky. It now cannot shift in any way. This whole expanse on this side is going to hold that nicely secure. I am going to put clips on the other side. The clips that I have, the edge clips, I'll show you one. These are the red snapper band, and the channel that the fabric has to slide into is really, really slim. So I'm actually not using these today. I'm just going to use my single clips and put very light tension, almost no tension, just the weight of the clip on this edge of the quilt to hold it secure. Remember, we want it just enough stretch to hold it flat, not to stretch it out of shape at all. And now we're all set for quilting. The design I'm doing today I call Filaments, and it came directly off a paper napkin that was at my kitchen table. And it just strikes me as a little bit Christmassy, the lights of Christmas, etc. This is very much the type of design that creates all over texture, not so much a picture. And the prints in this tree skirt are fairly busy, a small scale, and quite a lot of things going on. So the other tree skirt that I was telling you about, I'm quilting 2 for Fat Quarter Shop. The other one I quilted some pine cones sprinkled across it because there was a lot more negative space in that quilt and they would show up well. Where this one has a lot more print going on. And so this texture seemed perfectly suited. You won't really notice the quilting after it's done other than to provide that texture. You won't notice it as, pictorial. And quite honestly, that's my favorite style of quilting. It's just adding a layer of texture. I look like I'm squinting. I'm quite honestly finding quilting with eggshell thread on eggshell fabric quite difficult to see. So I am kind of having to lean in close to see where I'm driving. Good thing it's a small quilt. If I was not filming, what I would do at this point, if I was having difficulty seeing, is I would mess around with some different lighting options. So for example, turning overhead lights off and turning side lights on as in a lamp, possibly trying out my black light feature. There are different things like that that can make it much more easy to see. But because I'm filming today and I know that I will just get glare for you folks watching if I do that, I'm just going to power through. I find that there's no one size fits all for lighting that always works. In general, I prefer to have, good lighting. But it just all depends on the color of the fabric, the busyness of the print, the scale of the print. All of those things make a difference. So that's why I say one size does not fit all. So it's worth taking a few minutes if you're having a hard time seeing, just to experiment a little bit. And you can make the eye strain much less if you find what's working for this particular project. And I'm also stitching today in regulated mode, meaning you can hear the motor adjusting with the speed of my movements. That's called regulated stitching. I often like to stitch in unregulated, meaning the needle just goes at a fixed rate and I'm responsible to move the machine to determine the stitch length. But my unregulated mode has not been working very smoothly lately, so today I've opted to play it safe and use the regulated style. Well, when I get into this Santa Claus print, I'm really, it's anybody's guess as to where I'm quilting. It's not quite that bad, but yes, if I was not filming, I would be starting to play with light sources. And I call it quilting by shadow. So it's essentially what you do when you turn off even all the room lights and the lights on your quilting machine as well, any other source of light, and just put a floor lamp beside you, or if you're lucky enough to have a machine that's got some type of side mounted light, you just create a strong shadow from the side with that light source, and that can really be of help when you're quilting something that it's so difficult to see on. This design is just so easy to bend and flex in whatever direction you need it to go. Do some extra echoing if you need to travel. Extremely versatile. And it does, I think, have a Christmassy filament feel on this Christmas quilt, but I recently also did it on a baby quilt and I thought it suited that perfectly as well. It's kind of a playful, loopy design. And here we are ready to advance. So I will undo all my apparatus holding it in place. And again, because it is this Minky style backing, I'm going to be so gentle with how much stretching I do on it. I'm going to roll it up. Is that still visible, Mr. Producer? So as I tighten my backing, I'm a notch or two looser probably than I would typically be for a quilt top. There's a little bit of sag going on here in the middle. I'm okay with that. I want just enough tension to keep it smooth and not to have any wrinkles forming. Not enough tension that it's actually stretched in any direction. So as always, I kind of do this automatically without always saying it. I'm giving a little tug on the front to the fabric and also to the batting underneath it. I want to make sure that that batting is flowing smoothly and not getting pulled up in the middle. And if that doesn't seem like enough to you, you can always flip the top of your quilt back, especially with a small one. It's super easy. And just visually make sure that batting is nice and smooth and flat. Now I'm not measuring this quilt as I work on it, but I am again visually looking. Are my seam lines lining up with my rails this way? Do they look straight and perpendicular going from top to bottom? Just visually checking on the squareness of my quilt every time I advance it. And I see here right where these seams are joining, there's just a couple stitches coming undone on that seam. So I'm just going to take a few stitches back and forth over it just to reinforce that area a tiny bit. Here likewise. So many beautiful prints in this quilt. There is the red, white, and green, but it's kind of softened. The green is very soft. There's some super mellow greens. And then, of course, the huge addition of the corally pinks, which is just a very soft and delicate Christmassy feel. I'll add another little Minky tip in here. Traditionally, we quilters hate trimming up Minky quilts on our rotary cutter mats because it leaves just a horrendous amount of fuzz and it flies everywhere and gets in everything. A viewer passed on a tip to me that she had seen elsewhere, and that was to take blue painter's tape, and I'll show you what I mean. Bear with me while I go and get it. So here's my blue painter's tape, and on the seam line that I've basted on the wrong side of the quilt, when I'm all done quilting and take it off my long arm rail, I will literally put tape on the underside, on the Minky side, right along that seam line. And then when I trim with my rotary cutter and ruler, I'm cutting through the tape and the Minky, and it catches all that fuzz and keeps it entirely under control. It's absolutely genius. Certainly it would work with scissors as well, but I always do it with the rotary cutter. Somewhere back in the annals of time, I have a little Instagram reel about it. If you want to see it in action. One of my absolute favorite things about quilting freehand is my ability to determine exactly where my stitches lie. So in this seam that runs along here, there's quite a bit of bulk in these little corners, and you can see right beside my hopper foot, there's quite a bulge going on there. I'm going to purposely stitch over the thickest points because that will help it to lay down flat. It's just like magic. And I love working absolutely freehand. That is one of the reasons. It enables me to do that whenever I see the need for it, and I think it produces such a nice flat result. So I try to stitch either right over those thick places or within about 1/8 of an inch. I find that that does the best job of helping them to lay down flat. And my little pauses every so often here are for me to make sure that I see where I'm driving and where I need to go next. It is certainly difficult to see on this little stripe. And here's a thick seam again. Right here is a few seams overlapping. I'm going to stitch right through that. And that's the sort of thing you never really notice in the finished quilt, but you would notice it if you didn't do it. It's sometimes tempting to stitch around those bulky seams because it's easier. Sometimes you have to work a little to get the hopper foot up over them. But when you do that, what you risk is those seams standing up like buttons in the finished quilt. So I prefer to stitch them down. One other thing that I did on this particular project, knowing that it's a tree skirt and that it's going to have a giant slice made up the middle of it. Oops, I didn't get that echo very accurate. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Knowing that this is a tree skirt and it's going to be sliced up the middle to provide an opening to put it around the tree, I set my stitch length quite small to 15 stitches per inch. Much like you would on your sewing machine if you want to avoid, having to reverse at the beginning of your seams when you're piecing. Another option is to just do a smaller stitch length. I felt that that was an appropriate safeguard for quilting on this project, and that way hopefully they can cut it without running any risk of the quilting coming undone. And of course there will be stitching over top of it, also reinforcing it with the found edge, but it's just one extra level of assurance. And we're out of bobbin thread. And you know me, I don't do any kind of measuring or trying to guess when the bobbin's going to run out on my machine. I just let it run out, and then I try and back up to the last corner so that I have a join that doesn't show much. And pardon me, I'm just going to turn the light on while I undo the stitching. I'm struggling. There we go. The last corner is, for one thing, it doesn't show as much when I do a lock stitch over it, but also when you're on regulated mode, you always get a couple of short stitches there anyway at a corner because there's that tiny pause in your stitching, so it's a good place to do joins. So I'm walking off to the edge to pull my bobbin out and off camera to get my fresh bobbin, which I already had loading. So I'm using the same thread, both top and bottom, my 100% poly thread. While I'm over here, I'm grabbing a sip of coffee. I'm getting a little parched. And I dropped my blue seam ripper right where my edge was. So there's the light off, and I actually ran it a few stitches without realizing the bobbin had come undone. So I'm going to rethread, and I'm going to tell you guys a story while I do this. Usually I would just have to thread my needle at the most there, but I learned this last night. I was changing thread in my machine, and I forgot to pull the thread out of the bobbin. Forgot to pull the thread out of the needle. And so when I put my new thread in, and I went round to the front of the machine and I started stitching. Well, you can guess what happened. The knot came up to my needle. Thump, the thread broke. And so easy fix seems like, right? Just trim that knot off, rethread the needle, and away I go. But what I know, I've said to you guys before, and I forgot to say to myself, is that thump can make the thread fly out of some of its carriers, its loops. And you don't know that, you don't necessarily see it. So I rethreaded my needle and kept on stitching, and I ended up breaking the thread again just a moment later. And then I cued in. I was like, oh, if that thread breaks again in quick succession, something's wrong. So I went looking. And not only was something out of whack in the threading process in my intermittent tension, but when I looked at the back of the quilt, the quilting in between there was horrible, horrible tension because it wasn't threaded properly. So the moral to this story is, when something like that happens, like it just did to me, where there's a bit of a wrangle of thread, it's worth taking the time to do a little bit of rethreading. For me, that means going back to the intermittent tension, which is the last place that the thread kind of winds around, and redoing it. And it may not have messed up the threading, but it's a lot quicker to just run a check. And here's a pop quiz for you guys. Did you see that I just started those loops backwards? And what I'm going to do now is just continue on quilting. No one is ever going to know that those two quilts don't have an echo like everywhere else does. And they're kind of inverted. Because after all, texture is what we're creating, and texture is still there. So I had a closer look for a minute there at where I've quilted. This design, as you might imagine, is fantastic practice for making loops. And as you quilt, thinking about being rhythmic and smooth in your quilting. I'm even, trying that as I'm working on it today. Every so often I'll catch myself really zooming around those loops, like, kind of gunning it around the corners, if you will. And I'm just taking the time to think about it a little bit and focus on, hey, let's make those loops as smooth and rhythmic as we can. That all helps in raising your quilting skill, your control of your machine. It seems like a little thing, but it's really, really true. Let's just pull that tail out of there that we quilted in. All right, we're at an advance again, and this is the last one. It is a small project, so we're done with the magnetic bars now. So I've just left the needle down within that basted seam. The whole thing is just pulling up as I advance. Now that may be a little too far for you to see well, so I'm going to go ahead and baste around the bottom edge of this quilt, and then I'll back up just a little bit so that you can see and you're not obstructed by the chubby roll of quilt. Again, doing my visual checks, tugging on my batting a little to make sure that it's smooth, tugging on my quilt a little, kind of casting an eye over it, I can see again I've got a little jog in my seam allowance right here, so I need to be thinking about that when I'm creating this basting line, because I'll be starting on my right where it's a little bit longer. And I need to leave a bit of allowance for that area where the fabric is shorter. And I actually am going to have to forward just a hair. I'm at the end of I'm bumping into that front rail at the end of my reach. So I do have my magnetic channel lock on. I'm keeping that short spot in my peripheral vision, and I feel like I have not gone up far enough. So I'm going to make this easy on myself. I'm just going to stop right where I am, and I'm going to go back and create another basting line about 1/4 inch above. And that's going to have to be trimmed off. The other option would be take that channel lock off and do a slightly slanted basting line. That would be totally fine too. You'll end up with a quilt that's not quite square, but it is an option. Considering that it is a tree skirt, we're not going to panic too much about it being perfectly square, right? But this is the option I choose. We're going to trim off a little bit on this side to make all the sides equal length. But on your quilt, if you choose the other option, that's just fine too. More than one way to do this. And you can see I just have enough fabric to catch it there. About 1/8 of an inch. Now it's getting a little greater. There are some biased triangles in this quilt, so there's a fair bit of give to it. Here again, I've got a seam allowance that's just coming open a tiny bit, so I'm going to just do a couple stitches back and forth across it, just to reinforce it a little bit. Every little bit helps, right? And now we're rewinding the quilt a little. Again, going pretty gentle with my tension. I'm going to fix my clamps on the left. Super light, and basically just the weight of the clamp is holding that in place. Now let's see, we ended on the right, so I like to do reverse passes. They always seem to flow in the direction that you're quilting, whatever, well, most designs anyways. So if one passes left to right, I try and alternate the next one and go right to left. And I'm going to raise my take-up bar just a little. I can feel a bit of resistance going on there. There we go. You can perhaps see on camera that the quilting it's almost sagging over the end of my arm underneath. That's just the weight of the Minky pulling it down, because remember, I've only got enough tension on to hold it smooth, not to stretch it drum tight. So I do see that happening when I'm working with Minky. It tends to almost look and feel like it's sagging. But I've done it enough times to be pretty confident in saying we're not getting any creases on the back. There's enough tension on it to avoid that. Get a little closer to see where I've even quilted. This is no doubt the challenge to see the quilted. If you're enjoying this episode, remember to hit the little thumbs up button. If you want to see more episodes, subscribe and even click on the bell, and you will be notified whenever a new episode is going live. Every so often I've got a creative loop here where I'm finding, I'm risking going over my previous stitching. And I don't really want to do that too much. Although there are loops in this, it's not the end of the world. But certainly I do have some funny shaped loops. So what I'm kind of doing is prioritizing even spacing. So I don't have any big areas, an inch or more, where there is no quilting. And I don't have a bunch of quilting lines that are super tight together, because I've kind of got this half-inch spacing going on everywhere. So that's kind of my measuring stick, to keep it looking like it's uniform and consistently spread around the quilt. So spacing is my top priority. And creative loops, well, I'll be okay with that. And I'm kind of doing a narrow pass here with the idea that I'm going to get all the way over to the left-hand side and then go ahead and advance the quilt so I can see all the way to the end. And certainly I could have done the other way. I could have done a full-fledged pass, and then I would have had a very narrow one left afterwards. But I kind of like my last one to have a little more space for moving around as I'm trying to take a very rounded design and fill in all the corners of the quilt. And that's just personal preference. The end is in sight. I think I got some creative loops in there again. And we have a broken thread, or we're out of bobbin thread. I'm not sure which. Now that one was a very gentle one, so I think that my threading process is okay. Let's just see here. No, it was indeed a broken thread. I am just going to check my bobbin, however. I'll drop my little seam ripper there so I can find my place when I come back. Since I'm stopped, I'm going to check my bobbin. Well, it's a good thing I did. There's not very much left. So I'm going to step out of camera for a moment and start another bobbin loading. I thought that I would have enough with those two, and so I did not, in fact, load a spare one. So I will quickly get that going on my freestanding bobbin winder, so that it's ready when we need it. Once again, I am using Isocord 100% polyester thread, and I'm using the same thread on the top and in the bobbin. Handily, my thread broke right by a seam allowance. So I'm just going to do my splice right there. Something is amiss. Let's see. Let's have a closer look at the bobbin. Looks good, but something's not right, so I'll just take it out and put it back in. There we go. Just stop to clip the tails. So that is how I typically start a new thread when I'm working on an edge-to-edge design. As you can see, the quilting is not showing in detail on here. No one is going to notice if I bury the threads or not. So typically for, you know, family use type quilts, I do not take the time to knot and bury my thread joins. I just do a few lock stitch, tiny close stitches, and they seem to hold quite securely. Well, we're nearing the end here, so I'll mention again, if you do have any questions about this project, feel free to type them into the comments. I will check in and answer those questions. I would love to know if you all are busy working on Christmas projects. You can type that into the comments too if you want to. And let me mention again briefly some of the other places where you can find me. My podcast is called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and you can find that on any podcast app, or also you can go to podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. If you don't already listen to podcasts, that's an easy way to find an app that offers it and to choose it, and you can see all the catalog of episodes there as well. They're all easy listening. And I am on Instagram and Facebook, and obviously this channel, as Stitched by Susan, so you can find me in all those places. It may be amusing afterwards to look at the back of this quilt and see where some of these funny oopses are. A couple threads falling down there. I'll just pick those up. I may or may not post photos of the back of this quilt. No, I don't think it's that severe, but I do think there's a couple little wonky loops in there. You can see the advantages of the echoing that goes on in this design, and when I need to, I can not echo if I need to fill in a small space, and when I need to travel, I can echo an additional time. Either way, it certainly brings in flexibility, and it carries on with, you know, the even texture coverage that we're looking for, and answers the question of how to move around the quilt and how to fill in the little nooks and crannies. Echoing is a wonderful thing. Speaking of little nooks and crannies, here's one right here. There we go, single loop in that one. Little tiny echo in that big space. And I'm going to pretend that some of these just fell off the edge of the quilt. And when it gets trimmed up, they will just look like partial loops. Perfect. And that's it. And a few tight lock stitches, and we are finished. I will unroll just a little bit so you can see the middle of the quilt again and kind of get a big picture of what this all looks like texture-wise. And I will also get some photos that I can post online so you can have a good look at it too. There, we're getting a pretty good view. Excellent. How's that looking? I think that is the end. We've got us a finished tree skirt. Do we want main camera? I'm so used to taking questions at this point, it's hard to kind of shift my mental gear. But like I said, feel free to type in any questions and I will come back and answer them. Just to recap quickly, this was a tree skirt that we're working on, so as small as about a 50-inch square quilt. And some of the topics today were the Minky backing, so I focused a little bit on the loading of that and some of the cautionary things that I do to take care not to stretch that Minky backing out of shape at all. And then we quilted this edge to edge, very textural design across it, talked a little bit about basting, reinforcing some of the seams that are maybe coming undone a little bit at the edge or that don't quite line up, and how I kind of work that into squaring up my quilt. So that was today's topics. This tree skirt is a project for the Fat Quarter Shop, and I will have links in the show notes for the pattern, the kits that they sell, the fabric that is used, all those details. So if you're interested in making a tree skirt like this, you can find all those details in the show notes right below where we are now. Please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, to share it with your friends who you think would also enjoy it. I would sure appreciate that. And once again, Live and Unscripted is hosted the first and third Friday of each month, today being not live, but certainly unscripted, as you saw when the thread broke. So That's kind of the focus of my shows, is just inviting you into my studio to watch while I work in real time and see how long things actually take, how they actually go. It is perfectly normal to have thread breaks and tension problems, and you get to see how I deal with those as they arise. So thank you very much for joining me. Once again, I'm Susan Smith. We're in my studio, Stitched by Susan, and I will catch up to you next time. Enjoy your day.